Imagine traveling back in time about 4,000 years ago to a period from 2100 BC to 1600 BC. During this time, China was under the rule of the Xia dynasty, which was the very first established form of Chinese government. In this ancient China, the majority of the population were peasant farmers, merchants, or craftsmen working hard to make a living. Those in the ruling upper classes of society, like nobles or aristocrats, tended to keep themselves quite distant from the average Chinese citizen. This was somewhat similar to how things are in many countries today, where there's a divide between the government and regular people. Now, in any society, a government needs a way to deal with people who commit crimes or do wrong. Back then, the Chinese government had a system of punishments for serious crimes known as the 5 punishments of slaves. These punishments were used to penalize those who had broken the law in significant ways. They served as a way to maintain order and discourage wrongdoing in the society of ancient China. Just like how we have rules and penalties for breaking them today, ancient China had its own way of maintaining order and justice. Here's something interesting. Back in ancient China, the term slaves didn't quite mean what it means today. Instead, it referred to any male person in the Chinese Empire. This gives you a sense of how the ruling class viewed the regular folks in their society. So, when we talk about the 5 punishments of slaves, it's important to understand that it applied to pretty much all men in ancient China. Now imagine this system lasting for a whopping 4,000 years of Chinese history. To put that into perspective, most of us don't even know 4,000 years of our own country's history. For China, this time period covered what we call ancient China. It's worth noting that although these punishments were established during the Xia dynasty, it wasn't until the Shang dynasty, which began around 1600 BC, that we have the first recorded written history of ancient China and the actual use of these 5 punishments. So, you can see how ancient China had a long and rich history, and these 5 punishments played a role in shaping their society for thousands of years. It's fascinating to explore how different societies dealt with laws and justice in the past, isn't it? All right, let's dive into what these 5 punishments for ancient Chinese slaves were all about. Remember, these punishments were pretty tough, and they were used on regular folks in ancient China. Punishment number 1. Mo Qing involved face and head tattoos. This one was considered quite harsh because back then, they believed that marking your skin made you less than human. Imagine that. Plus, anyone with these tattoos was often shunned by society, making it a double punishment. Punishment number 2. Yi meant cutting off the offender's nose. And here's the painful part. They didn't use any anesthesia. Ouch, right? Punishment number 3. Yue was even more severe than Yi. It meant amputating the offender's left or right foot, or sometimes both. This was a life-changing punishment because in ancient China, most people were peasant farmers. Losing a foot made it super hard to earn a living. Punishment number 4. Gong was castration. Yep, you guessed it. They removed a man's testicles and penis. After that, these guys were sent to live as eunuchs in the imperial palace. This punishment was often used for folks involved in indecent behavior or those trying to start rebellions. Punishment number 5. Da Pai was the death sentence. This was also known as the highest punishment. Now we should pause here for a moment and talk about how serious this was. These punishments were no joke, and they were meant to make people think twice before breaking the law. It's pretty intense to imagine what life was like back in ancient China, right? Now let's talk about the ancient Chinese methods of execution for Da Pai, which meant the death sentence. Brace yourself because these methods were both creative and horrifying. The ancient Chinese took execution very seriously, and some of these methods were incredibly brutal. One method was quartering, which involved cutting the person's body into 4 pieces. You can imagine how gruesome that would have been. Another method was boiling alive. Yes, you heard that right. Some unfortunate souls were put into a pot of boiling water. It's hard to imagine the pain they must have gone through. Then there was tearing apart. This involved attaching each limb of the person to a chariot and pulling them in different directions until their body was torn apart. It's a terrible way to go. Cutting in 2 was yet another method. This one is pretty self-explanatory. The person was cut into 2 pieces. And finally there was Ling Qi, also known as death by 1,000 cuts. This was an excruciatingly slow and painful process, where the person was literally cut 1,000 times before they succumbed to their injuries. These 5 punishments of slaves, as they were called, formed the foundation of the ancient Chinese penal punishment system. It's a stark reminder of how harsh justice could be in ancient times. Now let's talk about the punishments that were specifically designed for women in ancient China. These punishments were considered somewhat milder than those inflicted on men, but they were still quite harsh. Let's take a closer look at the 5 punishments for women. Punishment number 1 was Ying Chong. In this punishment, the offender was forced to grind green beans. Now, this might not sound too terrible, but it was more psychologically torturous than physically painful. The women were expected to complete the task in a certain amount of time, and if they couldn't, they were given another bucket of beans to grind. The longer the punishment took, the harder the task became, making it increasingly challenging for the women. Next up, we have punishment number 2, Jiang Qing. This punishment involved squeezing the fingers of the offender between sticks. Think of it like ancient thumbscrews. Court ushers would pull the sticks taut to extract information or confessions from the women. It must have been excruciating. Punishment number 3 was Jiang Xing, which consisted of beating with wooden staves. This physical punishment was likely painful and degrading. Now let's talk about punishment number 4, Shi. This was a form of forced suicide. Women were given methods of self-execution, including cutting their throats, taking poison, or hanging themselves. It's heartbreaking to think that these women were pushed to such extremes. Finally, punishment number 5 was similar to the 4th punishment for men, gong, or castration. However, in the case of women, they were not castrated. Instead, they were confined to a small room with no food. They would remain in this dreadful condition until they either outlived their punishment or, tragically, died of starvation. It's a gruesome and distressing punishment that highlights the severity of the consequences for adultery or licentious behavior. While these punishments for women might be considered somewhat milder than those for men, they were still incredibly harsh and serve as a stark reminder of the tough justice system that existed in ancient China. As we move closer to modern times, the way punishments were carried out in China changed, just like the dynasties themselves. The original brutal methods, known as the 5 punishments of slaves, persisted for over 2,000 years, spanning the Shang, Zhou, and Jin dynasties. However, they eventually came to an end during the reign of Emperor I of Han, who ruled from 203 BC to 157 BC during the Western Han dynasty. They were replaced by a somewhat less cruel set of punishments known as the 5 punishments for serfs. The transformation of these punishments came about due to a remarkable woman named Zhang Tang, the daughter of a high-ranking official. Her father had been wrongfully convicted of causing the death of a noblewoman. Instead of simply pleading her father's innocence in the usual way, Zhang Tang decided to take a different approach. She wrote a letter to the emperor directly, and in it, she not only pointed out the cruelty inherent in the 5 punishments, but also made a daring offer. She offered to take her father's place and become a slave for life if that would spare him from the punishment he faced. Zhang Tang's words had a profound impact on Emperor Wen of Han. He was deeply moved by her heartfelt plea and her willingness to sacrifice her own freedom for her father's. Consequently, he decided to abolish 4 of the 5 punishments. This change marked the removal of all forms of mutilation and amputation from the list of Chinese penal punishments. Instead of these gruesome physical punishments, criminals were now sentenced to receive whippings for their crimes. The whippings were administered using bamboo strips or sticks, with each crime carrying a different number of lashes as its punishment. This new system was seen as a more humane way to deliver justice and was a significant departure from the earlier, more brutal methods. Emperor Wen of Han's decision to reform the punishment system was a pivotal moment in Chinese legal history. It was Zhang Tang's courage and her plea for compassion that helped bring about this change. The system of 5 punishments, with its roots stretching back almost 4,000 years in Chinese history, had evolved into something more just and less physically cruel, thanks to the efforts of a daughter's love for her father and an emperor's willingness to listen and change. In conclusion, the history of ancient Chinese punishments, known as the 5 punishments, offers a glimpse into a world very different from our own. These harsh penalties endured for thousands of years until a courageous woman named Zhang Tang and the compassionate Emperor Wen of Han brought about important changes. This evolution reflects the ongoing transformation of justice in human societies over time. Don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support means the world to us, and it helps us keep bringing you more great content. Thanks for being part of our community.